First part of the video, we're going to practice using the respiratory system. Then we'll learn how it all works. So take a deep breath in and then breathe out. Now that we've mastered using the respiratory system, we're going to learn how it works. Let's jump to the whiteboard. We're going to start with the nasal cavity. Now you're probably already familiar with the nasal cavity. It's the open area between your nostril and the back of your throat, but you probably haven't explored too far back there before. That was a picking your nose joke. Now you'll notice in the nasal cavity that there are these three ridges called the nasal concha. It's the same root as conch, like a conch shell. And so these are three shell-like ridges in the nose. And the purpose of these is to slow the air down, which will warm it, help it stay humidified. We also smell in the nose, so by keeping the air kind of swirling around in there a little bit longer, it helps with our sense of smell. And it can help trap pathogens in there. Think about if the air just went straight back down the throat right away, then it would be easier for pathogens to make it through. But if the air swirls a little bit, those pathogens can get caught in our mucus and our nose hairs and things like that. So the nasal concha are there to slow the air that we breathe in, to help trap pathogens, help us smell better, and warm and humidify the air that we breathe. Now at the top of this, in yellow drawn here, is the olfactory bulb. Olfactory just means smell. I think about like you're driving down the highway and you smell, ooh, that's the fact. There's like an old factory nearby and it smells really bad, like they're making dog food or something. And it's a smelly olfactory sense. The olfactory bulb has sensory neurons that hang down in here. And whenever we smell something, it's actually the molecules of that thing that are in the air are going to interact with those little receptors that hang down from our olfactory bulb and send signals then to our brain. So this olfactory nerve right here connects back to our brain so that we can detect what we're smelling. So next time you smell something that doesn't smell very good, remember, there's actual particles of that thing making it into your nose. All right, let's move on. Drawn here now are a couple of our nasal sinuses. Our sinuses are these mucus-lined cavities whose job is to make mucus. And of course, when they get infected, then we have a sinus infection. We've got kind of four sets of those. I've got two drawn here, the frontal and the sphenoid. The frontal sinus is right in here. The sphenoid sinus is kind of back behind the nose. We also have the maxillary sinuses, which are in our cheekbones, and the ethmoid sinuses, which are between our eyes. But just know for now that the sinus cavities are mucus-lined cavities that drain down into the nasal cavity, which is where we produce our mucus, our snot. Mucus, of course, is really important. It helps lubricate our nasal cavity and also helps keep pathogens in. It traps those pathogens, and if stuff gets in there that shouldn't be there, that's why we have a runny nose, to try to get rid of those pathogens that have made it into our nasal cavity. Up next, we have the oral cavity. The oral cavity, of course, is our mouth. Now, in my diagram here, it looks like we have a big open oral cavity, but most of that oral cavity is actually taken up by our tongue. Think of your tongue as this like little bitty piece that kind of like sticks out of your mouth, but your tongue is giant and it fills up most of your mouth. The tongue, of course, has taste buds, which are connected to sensory neurons, which send signals up to the brain for tasting our 5 things that we can taste: sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami. Anything else that we taste, like flavors, that's really our sense of smell. If it's not one of those 5, we didn't taste it, we smelled it. Up next, we have this little opening. It's the opening to a tube called the eustachian tube, and it's found sort of in the back of our nasal cavity right there. And that's going to connect our nasal cavity to our inner ear. Think of a time where you've been changing elevation, like going on a flight in a plane or driving up into the mountains, and your ears start to pop. Well, that's because the inside of your ear, not the part that you can get to like this, but the part that's on the inside of your eardrum, if that inner ear part has a different pressure than the air pressure on the outside of your ear, then it starts to feel weird, it can hurt. And then whenever your ears pop or equalize the pressure, that's because air can flow in or out of the eustachian tube. And that's why it helps to like chew gum or to swallow or to yawn. Those things all help open up the eustachian tube so air can pass in or out to equalize the pressure between the atmosphere around us and our inner ear. Now the back of the throat we have a special name for, which we call the pharynx. The pharynx, it's not a special structure, it's just a name for the back of the throat. So pharynx is the back of the throat, and we have this thing called the uvula. Now if you've ever seen a cartoon where the character opens their mouth and in the very back of the throat there's like this dangly red thing right there, I always used to think that was the tonsils, but it's not the tonsils, it's the uvula. The purpose of the uvula, which is this flap of skin that hangs down in the back of the throat, is to prevent food and other things that we eat or drink from making it into our nasal cavity. Now, it's not perfect. If you've ever had milk come out your nose because you were laughing while you were drinking milk, then that's because your oral cavity and your nasal cavity are connected and your uvula is not perfect. And whenever you were laughing, some of that food made it from the back of the throat here in the oral cavity up into the nasal cavity, and That's never a pleasant feeling. So the uvula prevents food from making it into your nasal cavity. Up next, we have two tubes that the throat divides into. One is going to be the esophagus, and that's where you want food to go. The other tube is the trachea, and the trachea we want to stay open because we breathe in and out, and that air goes into the trachea, and we're never not breathing, right? Generally. So it's helpful if we keep the trachea just open all the time. The one time when we don't want the trachea open is whenever we're swallowing food or drink. So to help prevent food or liquid from getting down into the trachea and therefore down into the lungs, which is what's happening whenever you take a drink of something and it goes down the wrong way and you start coughing, that's you getting that liquid or that food out of your lungs. Well, we've got a special structure to prevent this from happening, and that's called the epiglottis. The glottis is sort of a term for the top of the voice box right here, so epiglottis means above that. And whenever you swallow, this flap of tissue right here gets pulled on by a tendon right here, and it's going to bend that down to cover up the space right here. So the moment that you're swallowing food all goes down into the esophagus, and none of it goes down into the trachea, which would cause you to cough. So two things that keep the food where it needs to be. We've got the uvula, which prevents food from going up into the nasal cavity, and we have the epiglottis, which prevents food from going down into the trachea and therefore into the lungs. Now at the superior part or top of the trachea, we have something called the larynx. The larynx is another name for your voice box, and right here drawn are the vocal cords. Whenever you speak, air is pushed up through the trachea out of your lungs, and it causes the vocal cords to vibrate. The wider or longer your vocal cords, the deeper your voice will be. And the smaller your vocal cords, the higher it will be. And of course, you can change the pitch of your voice because you can change the vibration frequency of your vocal cords, but only to an extent. So we all have a limited vocal range. And if you have inflammation of this area where it swells up and your vocal cords aren't able to vibrate, then you've got laryngitis. Laryngitis is inflammation, that's the itis part, of the larynx, laryngitis. Now we need to protect our larynx, so we have a special piece of cartilage called the thyroid cartilage that sits in front of our larynx. This is also known as the Adam's apple, and men and women both have it. It tends to be more pronounced in men, so people think that just men have an Adam's apple, but really men and women both have it. It has nothing to do with the thyroid gland in the endocrine system as far as what it does or what it is. The only similarity there is where it's located, which is why they share the name. So thyroid cartilage protects the larynx. Next, we have the rest of the trachea. You'll notice the trachea is covered in these cartilage rings. I use light blue in the diagram here for cartilage. They're covered in these cartilage rings, and the purpose of that is to hold open the trachea. Like I said, we're always breathing. We want the trachea to never be obstructed because then we couldn't get oxygen into our lungs. That would be bad. So these cartilage rings hold open the trachea so there's always airflow moving in or out of our lungs. Contrast that with the esophagus, which stays closed most of the time if we're not swallowing food or drinking water. And at the bottom of the trachea, it splits into two what we call bronchi, or bronchus for singular, but two of them, so there's two bronchi. The bronchi enter each lung, and from there they're going to branch out into smaller divisions called bronchioles. So trachea, there's just one. They're split into two bronchi, and each bronchus splits into many bronchioles. That changing of the ending to oles, that just means they're smaller. Like arterioles are small arteries, or venules are small veins. Now in the lung, at the end of each bronchiole is a little sort of cloud-shaped sac called alveoli. Contrary to popular belief, alveoli are not my favorite type of pasta. That would be penne. Just kidding, all pasta is delicious. But the alveoli are where the air ends up going so that it can transfer oxygen and carbon dioxide back and forth between the air that we breathe and the blood vessels that enter our lungs. So each of these little alveoli that are at the end of the bronchioles, those are wrapped in little capillaries, little tiny blood vessels that connect to our bloodstream so that they can exchange the oxygen and the air that we breathe into the bloodstream and then take out the carbon dioxide that we don't need anymore out of the bloodstream so that we can breathe it out. So the alveoli is where gas exchange occurs. That's super important. That's the whole point of all of this, right? To get oxygen into our bloodstream. That happens in the alveoli. And of course we have two lungs. Now while the second lung is being drawn, notice something that this left lung, this is the left side by the way, it's the right side from your perspective, but if this person's facing you, it's their left. So the left lung has two lobes. So lower lobe, upper lobe. Our right lung, however, has three lobes. So we've got a lower, a middle, and an upper lobe. So right lung, 3 lobes, left lung, 2 lobes. Now around each lung is a pleural membrane. The lungs are in the pleural cavities, and the pleural cavities are surrounded by this membrane. It's really important actually. The pressure in the lungs right here, like in the bronchi and the bronchioles, is actually a little bit higher than the pressure in the pleural cavity that's surrounded by the pleural membrane. Think about it like a balloon. Your lungs are like a balloon. If the balloon has the same pressure as the air around it, it's actually deflated. We don't want our lungs to deflate. We call that a collapsed lung. It can happen whenever the lung itself gets damaged or if the pleural membrane gets punctured. So we have to keep this space right in there between the lung and the pleural membrane. We actually have to keep that at a negative relative pressure. It's got to be at a lower pressure than the lung itself so that the lung stays inflated. Like a balloon, the pressure in the balloon has to be higher than the pressure around it for it to stay inflated. So just remember, in the pleural cavities, the pressure is a little bit lower than in the lungs. Below the lungs, we have the diaphragm. So you may have had a music teacher say, to sing from your diaphragm, but you also have to breathe from your diaphragm. Your lungs, actually, you don't breathe with your lungs. You don't send signals to your lungs to breathe. You send signals to your diaphragm. What the diaphragm does is it contracts downward, which expands the size of your pleural cavity. That's going to cause air to rush into the lungs because of that pressure difference. Sort of like sucking liquid through a straw. So you contract the diaphragm down, that's going to cause air to rush into the lungs and your lungs then expand. But again, you're not controlling the lungs directly, you're controlling the diaphragm. So the diaphragm helps you breathe by expanding the pleural cavity. Finally, of course, all of the thoracic cavity is surrounded and protected by our rib cage. And the purpose of those is to protect our lungs and our heart and our other thoracic organs from being damaged. All right, let's do a quick recap. We have the nasal cavity, which is where we breathe air into our nose. We have the nasal concha, which are there to swirl the air and warm it, humidify it, trap pathogens, as well as keep the air there a little bit longer so that we can smell it better. We have the oral cavity, which is our mouth, and most of that's filled with our tongue. We have the olfactory bulb, which is for detecting smell. Molecules will connect to those receptors, and that'll cause signals to be sent back to our brain so we can process those things that we smell. We have the sinus cavities, which are lined with mucosa or membranes that produce mucus to help lubricate our nose and help flush out pathogens and things like that. We have the eustachian tube, which connects to our inner ear, and that's going to help equalize the pressure between our inner ear and the air around us. We have the uvula, which is going to prevent food from making it from our oral cavity up to our nasal cavity, which is not good. The pharynx is a name for the back of the throat. The epiglottis is a flap of tissue that whenever we swallow, it's going to close off the trachea to prevent food and water from making it down into our lungs. We have the esophagus right there, and then the trachea. At the top of the trachea is the larynx, which is going to be where our vocal cords are. The thyroid cartilage protects the larynx. That's the Adam's apple. The trachea is held open by these cartilage rings, and then the trachea branches into 2 bronchi. Each bronchus branches into bronchioles, and then finally down into alveoli. Alveoli is where gas exchange occurs. Oxygen will go from the alveoli into the blood, and carbon dioxide will go from the blood into the alveoli so that we can breathe it out. The lungs, of course, are surrounded by the pleural membrane, and the space inside the pleural membrane is kept at a lower pressure so that our lungs stay inflated. We've got the diaphragm, which we contract in order to breathe, and the rib cage, of course, protects all of the thoracic organs that we've been talking about. All right, here's a blank diagram. Take a moment, see if you can identify all of the structures in this diagram as well as what they do. Here we have the nasal cavity, which we bring air into. We've got the nasal concha, which are going to swirl the air. We've got the oral cavity, which is our mouth. We've got the olfactory bulb, which is for sensing smell. We have the sinus cavities. We have the eustachian tube, which connects to our inner ear. We have the uvula, which prevents food from getting into the nasal cavity. We've got the pharynx, which is the back of the throat. We have the epiglottis, which prevents food from making it down into the trachea. We've got the larynx, which is where our vocal cords are. We've got the thyroid cartilage, which protects our larynx or our vocal box. We have the esophagus, which is where food and drink go down. We have the trachea, which is where air goes down into. That trachea branches into the 2 bronchi, which branch into bronchioles, which end in alveoli, where gas exchange occurs with the bloodstream. We have the lungs, which are covered in the pleural membrane. The left lung has 2 lobes, the right lung has 3 lobes. The diaphragm, which will contract to help us breathe. And finally, the rib cage, which protects all of this. Whew. Take a moment and breathe. Okay, we're going to use our respiratory system. Breathe in. Breathe out. You think that's funny? Good job. Wait, where'd Alondra go? Where'd Alondra go? There she is. Wait, bye-bye.